We're very pleased to have with us Sohaila Abdulali to talk about her important, informative, insightful, and very moving new book, What We Talk About When We Talk About Rape. Sohaila, who was born in India and attended college and graduate school in the United States, has been a writer of novels and children's books, as well as quite a few other kinds of pieces, newspaper columns, op-eds, blogs, grants, annual reports, web copy, and so on. She's held a number of jobs and worked on a range of issues. The issue of rape is one she first wrote about while still in school after being raped herself shortly before leaving for college in 1980 at the age of 17. Taking an evening walk in Mumbai, she was gang raped at gunpoint, beaten, and nearly murdered. 3 years later, she wrote an article under her real name for an Indian women's magazine in which she recounted the crime. That article got quite a bit of attention for daring to discuss a kind of violence that Indian women were typically encouraged to keep quiet about. She also wrote her undergraduate and graduate theses on rape and ended up running a rape crisis center in Boston for a while. Eventually, she moved on to other things. Although she returned from time to time to the issue of gender-based violence, she did so without really getting into how it had affected her personally. She didn't want her own rape to define her life. Then, in late 2012, the story that many of you may remember, the story of a female student who'd been gang raped on a bus in New Delhi and subsequently died of her injuries, made headlines around the world. Someone dug up Sohaila's old magazine piece, and it went viral, prompting her to write an op-ed for the New York Times on sexual assault, which again drew a huge response. When the idea of doing a book on the subject came up, Sohaila didn't want it to be a memoir, but figured out a way to write about rape, not as a rape victim. Instead, she uses her own brutal experience as a springboard for a broader work that explores how cultures around the world handle rape. She incorporates individual stories of rape survivors with a wide-ranging discussion of such topics as consent, responsibility, male entitlement, rape as a political weapon, anger, and the possibility of forgiveness. Sohaila makes no claim about having all the answers, but she's clear on certain points: that victims deserve belief, support, and a fair hearing, that rapists, not their targets, are responsible for rape, and that survivors can go on to live full and joyful lives, much as she herself has. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sohaila Abdulali.
How's this? Can I turn this down? Word? Okay. Hi, so thank you for coming. I really wasn't aware that I had to give a whole talk, so I don't have that much planned, so I'm just going to talk. And I hope you all ask questions, because if you don't, I'm just going to keep reading till you die of boredom. So I maybe I'll start by just expanding a bit about how the book came about. I feel like can I stand back here? Is that not good for you? Because I want to see everyone. Okay. So the basic story he told was correct, except that it wasn't a gun. It was a knife, just in case you're feeling extra sorry for me. It wasn't a gun. So what happened is that I was 17. This awful thing happened, and 3 weeks later I went to college. And it didn't really occur to me that I should be traumatized for life. And it didn't occur to my parents either. So I just escaped that part altogether, though it was really terrible. And one of the biggest challenges of writing this book actually was that I wanted to address how serious it is But I also wanted to have a light touch, and I wanted to explore the reality that rape is not the end of the world. But while doing that, I didn't want to seem flippant and sound like I'm saying it's not a big deal, because it's a huge deal. It's just not the only deal. So I tried really hard to do that, and that was actually very challenging as a writer to do that. So anyway, so this thing happened. Then I went to Brandeis, and I was fine, more or less. And then I really kind of put it behind me and had a whole life. And then in 2012, as he said, there was this gang rape and murder. So the way the Indian magazine thing came about is that 3 years later at Brandeis, I thought, it would be so interesting if I wrote my thesis on rape in India, because it's actually quite fascinating. So I got a grant and I went back home, and I had this vision of finding rape victims around every corner and people. And it turns out, no, I found nobody. I only found me. There was a whole, at that time in India in the early 80s, the only way rape was dealt with was as an issue of the left political parties, where rape was seen as something that upper class men did to lower caste women as a political act of damage, which did happen. But someone like me, who was a middle class woman who'd been raped by lower class men, I didn't really suit anybody. And I thought I couldn't be the only one. And after the umpteenth person said middle class women don't get raped, I just got indignant, and I wrote this piece. I published it in a women's magazine with my photograph. And I just have to, people have often said I'm brave, but I wasn't actually brave. It was more like I was completely naive. I had no idea quite how radical this was. So I published it and made a bit of a stir, but there was no internet in those days. So it died, and I also let it go. And then I grew up and had a life. Then after this Jyoti Singh murder happened in Delhi, all over the world, media was they were looking for an Indian rape victim, and they couldn't find, the only one they could find was me. So someone dug out this magazine thing and published it, and it really turned my whole life upside down, because suddenly I was having reporters calling from India, from America, from England, from everywhere. I had a daughter who had no idea what had happened to me. She was 11. My brother had 2 kids. They all knew what rape was, but it just had never come up. So then I thought I'll just wait for it to die down. And then my husband, who's really a very smart person, said, why don't you think first about whether you do have something to say? And I thought I do, because, I was 17 then, now I'm 49 or whatever I was then, and I'm a mother, and I do have things to say. So I wrote this op-ed, which I was really lucky the New York Times took it. And then I was done, but I got 1,000 emails and from victims all over the world, on every continent, I think, except Antarctica, telling me their stories. And I felt very much like many of these people had never talked to anyone before, and I didn't want to not reply. So I replied to every single one of them, and then I saved them all in a file because it felt rude to delete them. Then I went on with my life, and every time I had an idea to write a book, I had already published my novels. Every publisher I asked about a book would say, why don't you write a memoir about rape? And each time I said no, because first of all, it seemed really boring and self-indulgent, and it would also be fake, because the rape it's not the be-all and end-all of my life. Everything that happened didn't follow from that. So I just kept saying no. And then last year, after I had written 3 years of newspaper columns, and I really thought I had a great idea for a book with all my columns, I approached a publisher, and she immediately wrote back saying, why don't you write a memoir about rape? And this was Penguin India. So I was so irritated that I wrote a really nasty little email back saying, I don't want to do this. And then she wrote back a really intelligent email that changed my life, which said, you don't have to write a memoir, but on and off, you've been thinking about this really for your whole life. You have things to say. Maybe you can answer some of these questions. And she had a list of questions that were completely fascinating, like boys and consent and all this. So I got really excited. And then in the end, I decided I did want to write a book. And funnily enough, even though it's not a memoir, because I think there are probably 30 other survivors in here and lots of other peripheral people, which I'll tell you about. In a funny way, it is a very personal book, because even though it's not about my life, it's about my attitude. So that way, it's kind of a memoir, non-memoir. And then I've been really, I have to say, I'm not the usual struggling artist who agonized over the book. It flew out of me in 6 months. It was amazing. I decided I didn't want to do research, so I didn't do much research. But what I did do was I told everyone I knew I'm writing this book. And every pathway led somewhere interesting. I knew certain things I wanted to say, but many things I didn't know. So for instance, the first 2 people I got, I have a friend who owns a bookstore in New York City, and she said, "Oh, you're writing a book on rape? You must talk to my friend Yasmin from Egypt. She's visiting." So then I sat down with Yasmin, and Yasmin turned out to be this unbelievable person in Egypt who began an organization called Opantish, who went out into the Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring when women used to get attacked by mobs and raped. They started a vigilante group where they would go and save these women, sometimes at the risk of getting raped themselves. So that made me realize I had to write a chapter on heroes. And then I called a friend of mine in Australia and said, "I'm writing a book on rape." And she said, "Oh, I just met this dentist. And this dentist specializes in trauma victims." So obviously I had to talk to the dentist. So the dentist was in Melbourne and we Skyped a few times. And she turned out to be this woman who does trauma-informed care. And I learned all the stuff about how dentistry is so connected with trauma. So then that became a chapter. And then, of course, I had my secret data bank of 1,000 emails, which I never thought I would go back to. So I went back to them, and I picked a bunch of people who didn't write to me in a very traumatized state, because I thought if they were still traumatized when they wrote to me and 5 years later they suddenly got an email, it seemed a bit unfair. So I picked people who had already kind of come to some kind of terms with it, and I contacted, and a lot of them are in the book. So it's kind of a weird little book, but it's just questioning the global conversation. I talk to people from every continent. There is my story. Things about it surprised me. For instance, it wasn't meant to be a memoir, but somehow one of the heroes in this book is my father. He just kept appearing in the book because he was sort of a textbook for how you should behave. So that's my book. It's a whole lot of things put together. And then the last thing I want to say about the book as a book is that I had this whole idea that I wanted to write very sensibly about rape, because I think one of the big problems is that it's so emotional and so loaded and so heavy that we just kind of go crazy when we think about it. So I wanted to bring down the temperature and write in a sensible way. But then after I'd been writing for a month or 2, I suddenly thought, well, am I being too cold and objective? I don't want to not acknowledge that it's awful. And that day I had read an article in the New York Times that really upset me about a Yazidi girl who was a sex slave, and her name was Sohaila. And there was something about just reading her story. So then I wrote this little thing. I wasn't even sure at that time whether it would be in the book. And I called it A Brief Pause for Horror. And I said, this is just a brief pause for just, if you've been raped, you don't have to read this part. But for other people, just to remind you that this is really awful. And then I thought the brief pause idea was really great. So it ended up being that I have this book and I have 5 brief pauses in it. There's horror, fury, ennui, for when I was just bored of the subject, terror, and confusion. So it was really a fascinating project, and I actually take the subject very seriously, but I had a lot of fun writing it. So what I thought I'd do is, I hope people have questions, but I thought I'd read just a couple of small pieces, just for a couple of minutes each, and then I can ask questions. So this chapter is called, and that's how the chapters began too, because people would say things and suddenly I think, that's a whole topic. So this one is called Your Rape is Worse Than Mine. And I started off with a quote from Kevin Powers. Have you read him? He's written this novel called The Yellow Birds. It's about war. So the quote is, "Nothing is more isolating than having a particular history. At least that's what I thought. Now I know. All pain is the same, only the details are different." And just so you know, the woman I mentioned, Kalki Koechlin, is a film star in India. So I'm sitting in a Mumbai suburb with Kalki Koechlin, and she is telling me about the sexual abuse she lived through as a child. I am aghast at what I'm hearing. I thank her for telling me her story, and say, I cannot imagine how she has come so far in working through it. I cannot conceive how awful it must have been. I can't imagine going through your experience, she says. I can't think of anything worse. There's something slightly unhinged about the scene. Two grown women, each insisting that the other deserves the prize for worst rape. Is one rape worse than the other? This is a ridiculous question. Why do we insist on ranking sexual assault? Survivors do it to our own discredit. I remember sitting in a support group and thinking to myself that my rape wasn't as bad as those of the other poor losers. No matter how many stories, no matter how many victims, I'm always appalled afresh. It always sounds so terrible. Mine always seems more manageable. I'm not sure why we do this. It's a weird phenomenon that I have seen over and over. In my experience, only individuals do it. Put us in a group, and we humans are usually eager to claim the mantle of victimhood. Collective victimhood is well documented. But when it comes to sitting in a room on an August afternoon and talking about rape with a fellow survivor, I'm always aghast and appalled, and convinced that the other person suffered more than me. Perhaps there's some defense mechanism at work. If someone else is worse off, suddenly what you're dealing with isn't so bad. It doesn't always work, of course. After I had 2 miscarriages and one man helpfully told me about his wife's 6 failed pregnancies, I just wanted to put my head in a pressure cooker and boil it. But sometimes it does. I'm not wholly convinced about my defense mechanism theory. I know how bad my rape was, but everyone else's still seems worse. I don't think it's because I'm trying to downplay my story. It's because I know my story. I know it beyond the few sentences I've written or the words I've used to describe it to so many people over the years. I know the tiny little details, although by now it's pretty hazy, a rather wonderful side effect of time. I know what they did, and I know what I felt, and I know how bad it was. But I know I made it through. When you experience something firsthand, you know its colors and smells, and the full horror of the hands pulling off your shoes. But you also know the limits of your pain and suffering. You don't have to wonder. And reality, no matter how bad, is more manageable than unknown horror. I was never in Kalki's position, so how do I know I would have survived? I know I survived what happened to me. No matter how bad it was, here I am. Here is the East River flowing outside my window. Here is a bowl of pomegranate seeds, deeply joyously red. Here is a little plastic pig that my spouse gave me when we first met. Here is my brother wearing a suit and tie, looking seriously at me in a photo that always cracks me up. Here I am. No matter what happened, here I am. Whatever the reason, ranking rapes is a prime example of the magical thinking that swirls around rape. Seems like no matter how rational we are, when it comes to life's big things, death, pain, birth, love, we quickly revert to charms and chants and magic potions. So what if it doesn't work? So that's one. Then I have a tiny little chapter. It's called the Abdulali Guidelines for Saving a Rape Survivor's Life. It's just what you do. So I say she, but the guidelines apply equally to all genders. Be horrified, but don't fall off your chair so that she has to take care of you. Believe her. No ifs, ands, or buts. Just believe her. Let her take the lead. If she wants to talk, okay. If she wants to be quiet, okay. If she wants to cry, okay. If she wants to joke, okay. If she wants to throw things, okay. Ask her what she wants. No need to guess. Encourage her to get help. Medical, legal, physical, mental. But don't force it. Don't ask her for details, but let her know you're open to listening if she wants to elaborate. Don't question her judgment. Let her frame it the way she wants, in the words she chooses. Don't try to understand and analyze. Just be there. Remember, this is the same person you knew before you knew she was raped. Treat her the same. Something terrible has happened to her, but she is the same person. She might also need reminding of this. And last but not least, I could give no advice better than Caitlin Moran's. Don't be a dick. Then I have a third section, but I thought if people want to ask questions, we can do that. Or I can keep reading, bore you to death. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Priyanka, and I have a question which isn't directly related to what you just read, but I was really interested because you're an Indian woman and you're speaking about rape, and I grew up in India up till the age of 13, and something really interesting that I've seen, it's that people are talking about rape more. I'm from Chennai, but the solution to that is we're going to take these boys and we're going to make sure they never speak to women ever again. Like my cousin in his school, they monitor their Facebooks to make sure that they're not like speaking to girls. They teach men that women are like gods, so they're objects that you're allowed to see but not touch. And I often feel like this actually leads to more sexual abuse in the future because it creates women as a sort of like sexual object you're never allowed to see. And I was wondering what your opinion was about how India is dealing with rape and what you think that they could do better and what they're doing well.
Actually, what you're saying is just the age-old thing that we've always done. Women are, goddesses to worship or objects to fuck. I mean, it's nothing new. It's just a new way of doing it because now we have the internet, so we can monitor our Facebook or whatever. So I think that, I don't know, I think that things have changed in one fundamental way in India, which is that rape is at least on the table for discussion. You might not like a lot of the things people say. I was really appalled after the Delhi murder that there were all these protests on the street with people talking about castration and hanging, and it just didn't sit well with me. I don't feel like that's the answer when the problem is really all of us in a way. So I think it's really good that there's a conversation. I mean, just as an example, when I was growing up, I was really shocked when I was raped. It never occurred to me that such a thing existed. But now that's not true. People talk about it. I can go, my mother has a driver. We sit in the front seat of the Jeep and we discuss rape. This never happened. This is great. I like that. I like the fact that Me Too is happening in India in a big way. It's really affected people. But I can't stand here and say that I know that even one rape has been prevented or one rapist has been put into jail as a result of all this. I have no idea. So I hope it makes a difference. I believe in conversation and words, but I don't know if ultimately it's going to make a difference. I hear about people being angry and going out and expressing their anger. That's true. I just don't know. But I always think talking about stuff is good, even when people say stupid things, because it's good to talk. It's been too loaded. I mean, I have friends who won't buy the book because they don't want their kids to see the word on the cover. But they would buy books on genocide. So I really don't see why rape should be any different.
I apologize for my voice. You do talk a lot about your father in the book, and I wonder if you can elaborate or explain to people here how his response was so very, very odd in Indian culture and what a difference it made in how you went on from that event.
Sure. I do think it was very odd in Indian culture, but I have to say that the more I talk to people, it was odd in any culture. Because one of the things that happened in my book is that I'll get back to him, the first 4 people that I interviewed just at random, from different countries, all had stories where they had told someone really close to them, a friend, a mother, a lover, what happened to them. And the response was, what did you expect? You were in the nightclub, what did you expect? You open your door, what did you expect? So that's why I wrote a chapter called What Did You Expect? And so these were not just Indians. So I used to think my father's really an unusual Indian, but I think he was just an unusual guy. And the way what happened is that my family had already moved to America, but he and I were back in India for, just to visit. And I was about to go to college. So my mother wasn't there. It was just my father, my grandma, and me. So when this happened, it was just him and me, really. And it was at night that it happened, and they kind of kidnapped us, the people. So when I came back, my father had been out searching for me. And he was out searching, and I had come home, and I was wounded, and we were bleeding and all this. And I was sitting on the sofa, and he walked into the house He took one look at me, he picked me up, and he ran up 4 flights of steps to the roof. He just picked me, and then he put me down on the terrace, and he said, "What happened? What can I do? I'll do anything you want." And I told him, and he said, "Just tell me what you want. Do you want me to call the police?" I said, "Yeah, of course, I want to report it." The guys had let us go because we had promised not to tell anyone. But I guess we didn't really mean that. So we called the police, and then I took it for granted because obviously I had always come first for him. So the police came, they didn't believe us. It was a nightmare, it was a horror. They were going to lock me up. It was all terrible. He just threw them out. He couldn't care less. My relatives came and, don't tell the mother, don't do this. And he threw them out. And he was just amazing. And he didn't know what to do. I found out later that he kept disappearing throughout the night, and I didn't really know why. And years later, my mother told me it's because he kept leaving to cry, which was very sweet. But he didn't put his pain onto me. And he just, then a few days after it happened, I think 3-4 days, I still hadn't been well enough to leave the house. There was an article in the Times of India about a crime that had happened where a man and his wife were going home on a scooter at night, and they were stopped by a gang of men who took her away. They abducted her. He went home, went to bed. That's it. Didn't report it. And the next morning she came home, sort of tattered and torn. They had raped her. She went into the kitchen. She set herself on fire and she died. And the way the story was reported in the paper was that she's such a hero. She's such a hero. She'd rather be dead than dishonor the family. And my father and I just couldn't believe the story. It was really confusing for us because for some reason we'd been in that culture and never imbibed this very obvious thing. And we couldn't understand why she was the hero. And so we sort of just learned all this stuff together. And then when I got well, I was going to go out one day and I put on a really bright shirt. And he said, "Don't wear that shirt." I said, "Why?" And he said, "People will see you." And I said, "But why shouldn't they see me?" And, I have nothing to hide. It's not a secret. I'm not ashamed. He said, "You're right." And he took that really to heart. And then a couple of days later, we were visiting some neighbors, a very conservative family who had no idea. And we were having tea and biscuits. And suddenly, in the middle of the conversation about something completely different, my father said, "My daughter was raped. And there's nothing to be ashamed of." And they just froze. It was totally inappropriate and totally wonderful. So he was just like that. And I was really lucky. And I realized that in the Rape Crisis Center and also with the people I talked to, because he just did the right thing. He did what you should do with any crime. Rape is a really awful crime, but why if you get mugged and beaten, is it a story to tell at a party? But if you get raped, you keep quiet. It's really confusing. And in the book, I talk a lot about how we have to face the fact that it's because it is related to sex and we're uncomfortable with sex. So yeah, and my father just somehow kept sneaking into my book because he kept being a counterexample to all these terrible stories I was hearing about people's parents throwing them out and disowning them and bad things. So there he is.
So did you have an editor who wanted you to do more research and get some science in there, or they were like, go for it, write what you know about the people you're talking to?
Actually, there's a lot of research and science. I ended up doing some research and science. So it's not all just my opinion. So I did do it. There's plenty of numbers. But I'm glad you asked, because my editor's story is, I really enjoy my editorial process because, the poor Penguin India editor who I yelled at is the one who got me going. But then I didn't actually send my proposal to her. I did, but she liked it and they weren't paying me enough money. So I said no. Then I sent it to a publisher in the UK who turned out to be unbelievable. She immediately took the idea and then she sold it to the same woman in India, Mansi. I'm so glad. So Penguin is my publisher in India. Then she sold it to Penguin in Australia, and then she sold it to the New Press here. So I have these 4 publishers, and usually the publishers are quite competitive. But it's been this amazing thing. I call them my 4 wives, and they join together. So even though it's published on all these different continents, they like Candida is my UK editor and my main editor. So she worked with me on the whole thing. And then when I did my first draft, she said, well, should we send it to the others to look? And I said, no, how many editors can I have? How many things? She said, look, you don't have to listen to them, but they all have their own say on their own contents. They know their stuff. So let's just send it to them. You don't have to accept what they say. So we did, and it was amazing. All these, the four women, they all read it 4 or 5 times. They all had amazing comments. They all worked together. It's been really, I'm one of those people who just can't complain about my publishers. They've been amazing. And they even coordinate all they all have publicists. I now have 4 publicists. It's really, I just think of those guys who raped me and made me promise not to tell anyone. I feel very happy. They all talk to each other and plan, when, this is all just beginning. It just came out. But yeah, it's been amazing with the publishers. They've all been, and I think Candida, the UK one, is actually the perfect one to be my main, because they all edited, but it was really done when they just had tweaks. But she had full faith in me. At one stage I called her, I said, I've just written the weirdest thing. I don't know where it came. She said, just write. And I said, I don't know what the beginning is. I don't know what the end is. She said something really interesting. She said, we are actually a narrative species, and we automatically put a beginning, a middle, and an end on things. So it might seem jumbled to you, but I promise you it'll come together. And it really did happen like that. I had all these jumbled things, and then one day there was an order. Then I called her up in January and said, I'm never going to finish because I keep writing. I can't stop. There's so much to say. I keep thinking of these new chapters. How will I know when to stop? And she said, oh, you'll know. And then suddenly in March, one day I woke up and I'm telling you, it was like giving birth to a baby where this thing had to get out. And that day I knew the book was done. And I said, in fact, it was early. It was before deadline. I said, you have to take this book. I can't take it in. So it was a very weird, organic kind of process. And they have all been amazing. So, and they all have their stories. Like Ellen, the American publisher from New Press, which is the book you have, she actually met Candida, they're old friends at a book fair. Candida had it rejected by 11 American publishers already and given up. So she met Ellen, and Ellen took one look at the catalog and said, I want that book. So Candida sent it to her, and Ellen was flying to New York that night, and she read it on her phone. And she landed, and she called up and made an offer for the book. And it was too late. Like, it's not in their catalog or anything. It was too late. The books had already been done. So she flew to Kansas or someplace for the sales rep meeting because you have to convince sales reps, because it's not going to go into stores if sales reps don't sell it. So she went there, she said she got them all so excited and worked up, and people were weeping. And then she showed them the cover. And apparently some innocent man said, well, I don't like the way it's handwritten. And then some woman got up and said, we don't need to hear from any men. And then he sat down. And, and then she said they had a huge argument about whether it should be paperback or hardcover, because usually things come out one or the other. But they couldn't agree. And so she said, we've never done this before, but they published both. So there's hardcover. So all these strange little things happened, and I just felt really supported. And I felt like I could say no to all of them when they had ideas I didn't like. And they were fine, but so yeah, it's been really, I hope people buy it, but even if they don't, it's really been, it's been a real fun process that way. It was also heavy and intense, and there were really sad moments talking to people because everyone didn't come out, and I was really, really careful. I have a really good friend who I sent her the first draft before sending it to Candida. Anyone, I said, look, just take out anything that makes it look like I'm making light of it, because I don't mean to. So she found a bunch of stuff. She said, look, if you say this, it's fine, but in the book, it looks like you're just making a joke. So that was important to me, because, it's like I didn't want to live up to the expectation of the morose rape victim, but I also didn't want to be like, no big deal. No. In fact, last night I was on PBS, on NewsHour, and then I'm on Twitter now as part of this whole thing. So some guy tweeted and said, I don't think she was raped. So I just didn't fit whatever. So I wanted to write back to him, but I didn't. So anyway, yeah, so the
cover. Just to clarify about the cover, well, we have lots of copies here. We only have the soft cover. we have one hardcover, which is Sohaila's, which she's happy to part with if anybody's dying to have
At a premium.
and we can order you some hardcover if you're interested. But we do have the soft cover here in considerable quantity for at the end if you'd like to buy a copy.
Sure. I'll read. This is actually, what's the other thing number 3. Yeah, one of the tough things was writing about consent, especially because it was so interesting. I kind of sold the book to Canada, who took it on faith as this little book on an obscure subject nobody talks about. Gave me my book contract, and then a month later, Me Too happened. So suddenly, I went from being this obscure topic to being the topic, which wasn't, really the intent. But it was great for me because A, I didn't have to be the world's only rape victim anymore, and B, there was lots of material. But one of the things that was really hard to write about was consent, because it is very complicated. So I wrote a chapter called Yes, No, Maybe, and I'll just read you a page from that. And I just started off with quotes again. The first one is from Colin Dexter, Last Bus to Woodstock. Confucius, he say, girl with skirt up, she run faster than man with trousers down, A. And the second one, we think Margaret Atwood said it, but we're not sure. It's, men are afraid women will laugh at them. Women are afraid men will kill them. And here's my first page. Yes means yes and no means no. If it were that simple, this book would fit on an index card. But here we are, pondering the meaning of consent. It's both really easy and really difficult. Blue Seat Studios created a charming little video. Consent, it's simple as tea. It uses stick figures to illustrate why having sex is like a cup of tea. If you wouldn't force someone to drink tea, why would you force them to fuck? If someone said they wanted tea and then changed their mind when you made it, would you pour it down their throat? And so on. It's a nice tool for children, but sex isn't a cup of tea. If you don't really want a cup of tea, but you drink it because you're afraid you'll offend your host, that's good manners. If you don't really want sex, but you do it because you're afraid you'll offend your date, this happens all too often. That's not quite the same thing. It might not quite be rape, and then again, it might be. What are you afraid your date will do if you say no? A friend of mine went to a brothel when he was a teenager. He had had only a few sexual experiences and wanted to expand his horizons. He went swaggering in and put his money down. A sweet and very young-looking girl took him into a little room. We both sat on the bed, he told me, and I didn't know what to do. She was just looking at me. So I said, "Take your clothes off." She said no. So then I asked, I didn't know what to do. Was I supposed to force her? She said no. I said, okay. Then we lay down next to each other for a while. Then the time was up and I left. This makes perfect sense to me. Yes, he paid for sex. But if she didn't want to take her clothes off, he had no right to rip them off. He could have asked for his money back, but he was correct not to force her. It's obvious to me, but plenty of people might think that once he'd paid, she was his to do with as he pleased. Being a sex worker doesn't mean you deserve to be raped. Neither does being a spouse. Again, your ability to consent depends on who you are and where you are. In Canada, raping your wife is a crime, except if you come before Superior Court Justice Robert Smith, who ruled that a man who didn't know it was illegal to force intercourse on his wife was not guilty. In India, Ghana, Jordan, and numerous other places, once a woman is married to a man, she signs over the rights to her vagina and the rest of her body to her husband. No consent, no problem. The law says marriage means full access, no questions asked. So, in fact, speaking of sex workers, one of the most interesting parts of researching the book was I traveled to central India and spent a couple of days with a sex workers collective and talked to them about how rape affects their lives. And it was fascinating because I went expecting to hear terrible tales of violence, which I did. But I also found these really empowered women who had decided to kind of own own their occupations. Most of them had lovers. They could say no to clients when they wanted. They had banded together so that, if somebody got abusive, they had a knock on the wall so their sister sex workers could come help them. So it taught me a lot about empowerment. But I just see that consent is a complicated thing. That's all I marked to read. Yeah.
So I have a follow-on question.
You have to.
I haven't obviously read the book yet, but based on what you're describing as sort of the structure and how you put it together, it's a collection of many stories. But you were also, I guess, encouraged by your publishers to do research and get some facts. So I'm curious how, because I think in many ways you are trying to be a storyteller, but then you want the power of numbers to also convey something. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you combine those two, because they are hard. I did that, I know, for my dissertation, for my PhD, and it was very difficult. So I'm just curious, based on this pretty random sample that isn't necessarily representative.
Right.
And I hate to go to the science of it, but that's sort of where I'm thinking, how would you then take this, to the next step? Like, how do you use this as powerful data to create change, whether it's at the conversation level, at action, whatever?
Actually, it wasn't my publishers. My publishers really left me alone. They just said, do what you want and we'll deal with it later. So, which was really nice because I really felt free. I just sat there and wrote. But, I hated the idea of going and reading books on rape and doing all this stuff. And I just immediately gave myself permission not to. But then as I wrote, I realized there was stuff I wanted to know. Like, for instance, remember I read the bit about victimhood and how you don't feel like a victim compared to other people. So then I went and read about it because I was interested. And I found that there's a whole theory of collective victimhood, where when people are together, it's very easy to take on that mantle. So it kind of, it was just me. I'm not quite as shallow as I like to pretend I am. So I did want backup. And so I looked for backup. And then the other thing is I had a secret weapon research tool, my husband, because he just is a news junkie and reads everything. And so every day I'd sit at my computer and he'd just be sending me links. So it was great. So, anything that was topical, he would send me, and then I'd kind of go look for that or find an expert. So it really happened organically. I didn't think about how to use it as data for a study. But I feel like, I'm not trying to present a study where, say, 60% feel this way and 40%. But I do feel like, especially when I was saying something kind of outlandish that hasn't been said before, I try to get a little backup for it because it seemed to make sense. And then also, rape is not the only thing I'm interested in. And sometimes so many other things connected really well. Like there was this movie, I'm blanking on the movie, but it was made by this guy, Yancey Ford, who is a trans man who, when he was still a woman, he's black, his brother was murdered, and he made a film. It's called Strong Island. That's what it's called. It won a lot of awards. And in this film, there's just this one tiny little part where he's talking about feeling guilty and responsible. And I saw this part, and it was like this huge light bulb went on my head because we all trained to think that if you feel guilty, or you feel responsible, it's bad because, it's very anti-feminist because it's not you who's responsible. And that's true. The woman is never responsible for the rape, but it gave me a way to think about why we feel like that. It's not necessarily self-loathing, because the way he put it is that he said, my brother was murdered and I felt so guilty that I hadn't gone that day, or whatever it was that he thought he did that caused the chain of events. And he said, but for me, it was better to feel like that than to feel like I had absolutely no control. So that to me was a real revelation. So just the fact that while I was writing the book, I was doing lots of other things, I could make these connections. And then I could quote actual people, and it wasn't just me blathering on. So I don't know how it can be useful, but there's, I tried to back things up.
Thank you so much. I had a question on insights that you've gained in the process of your research and exploring stories about the shifts that happen in social interactions and relationships, whether it be your story or the stories of the other women that you've spoken to, and the kinds of skill building that you think is needed. And whether there are any cultural variations in that. So it's more of sort of what requires focus, both from the community or from within the family or outside, and what are the kinds of shifts in experiences that you've seen. So if you could speak a little bit about social interactions and relationships, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, in my own personal interactions, I haven't seen that many shifts because I sort of dealt with it all in my life before. But I'm not an expert, but I certainly have many opinions. And I really think that the thing that needs to happen the most is that we bring it down to that we understand that rape is a choice. It's a choice. It's not the weather. It's not deeply marauding men who can't control themselves. I have this story in my book where I ask a question, to men who are reading the book, saying that, we've all grown up with this idea that you don't want to lead men on because, after a point they can't stop. There's this whole thing of men can't stop, and I've never understood that. And my question is that if you were in a room having really hot sex with somebody you're really attracted to, you're right in the middle of it, and your grandmother walks in, and she's looking at you, could you stop? Probably you could. So it's really not about the point of no return. So I think this is good and bad because it makes you realize that it's not something they can't help. So I think if we keep that basic thing in mind, and the other basic thing is that sex is meant for everyone. Sex is not something for men to enjoy and women to deal with. It's meant for everyone's pleasure. And if we, in our own little ways, give that message to our kids that, you have rules, you have affirmative consent, all that stuff is great. But if you are either a boy or a girl, if you're a guy, if you actually are interested in whether the girl's into it, that's a huge... I'm not talking about rapes like mine, where, it was going to happen no matter what, because it was strangers, it was a whole different thing. I'm talking about the kind of acquaintance date rape thing, which is more common. If you care, if it matters to you, if the other person's into it, that's sex. Sex is not you taking what you want. And for women, if we acknowledge that, we have a right to pleasure, that sex is not just something for us to bear. Even the whole mythology about virginity, like for men, it's a great thing, for women, it's going to hurt. And why? Why does it have to be like that? So I think that at the personal level, that's something that I would prescribe if anybody asked me, which you did. And then the other thing is at the global level, I think we need to explore really what justice means. I think in this country and in India, the justice system is really broken because there's so many dynamics of race and class and caste and power. So if we generally try to pay attention to that, it will become better for everyone, including rape victims. But the other thing is that I don't know the answer to this, but I feel like someone needs to write a book on how do you figure out, how do you pass out the whole business of evidence and proof in cases of rape, because it's really tough. It's really tough when it's a he says, she says thing. I completely believe in due process. But how do you do that? It is a little different. And I'm not sure what it is, but I think that's a question we need to grapple with. And I don't know how.
Hi. Thank you again for everything that you're sharing. I'm really excited to read your book. I'm curious about if when you're thinking about the impact of this book and just even us here, how we can just be ripples in the story that you're telling and sharing. Is there any group of people or type of person in the world that you're like, if this person gets a hold of my book, I really hope that they take time to digest everything? Like, is there like an ideal group of people that you hope have exposure?
Yeah, I'd like Donald Trump and all his cabinet to read it. That would be great. But the thing is that I it's a funny thing because I know this sounds really naive, but I wrote the book mostly sitting at my desk in my pajamas, and I didn't really believe that it would ever become a book. So I kind of wrote whatever. I didn't censor myself. And I didn't have, you're supposed to have a ideal audience in mind. I didn't have that. So while writing, I didn't have an audience. But now, I really hope it's for everyone. I want women to read it and take heart to know that rape doesn't have to end things. And I want men to read it because I do believe that many men are very good-hearted and want to be part of the solution. And I hope I've given some pointers. So I hope it's for everyone. But I wasn't really thinking about. Now my next book, I'll be much more guarded.
Thanks so much. Along those lines, did you find writing to be therapeutic at all? Or especially since you've gone through sort of several iterations of telling your story or telling your message. So from your op-ed to this book, have you found it to be a way to sort of understand your experience, and you're so refreshingly sort of okay with everything, and you know, life goes on, right? But if writing has been therapeutic, how has it been therapeutic?
I was wondering about that before I set out writing it, because I wondered if, you know, I wasn't so worried about myself kind of going into a dark place about my own experience, because it really has been a really long time, and I have been through all that awful stuff, and I didn't think that would come. But I did think that it would be a real downer talking to so many victims, because I remember at the Rape Crisis Center, I talked to hundreds and hundreds, and you know, it's hard to hear these stories. But the funny thing is, it was the opposite, because I kind of forgot that at the Rape Crisis Center, people called when they were in crisis. Here, the people I talked to for the book are people who have adjusted or have somehow integrated it into their lives not so differently from me, which is actually most people. So I found it really inspiring. I found it inspiring to find the kind of courage people had. But so it wasn't so much therapy in terms of the rape, but I did, in fact, in many ways, it was like a very nice way to personally to see how far I've come. And the weird things like Chris said about my father sneaking into the book, it was actually therapeutic in that realm, because my father died some years ago, and I've been very grief-stricken, and it felt almost in a way of doing something for him. So it wasn't rape-related, but it was family-related. So I think it's been actually very therapeutic for my family, because my mother, who's always been very supportive but a bit nervous about the whole thing, is just out there handing out copies to everyone, and it's great. So it's been. But in terms of dealing with the rape, I think that most of that was done before. But I was a little concerned.
We have time for one more question, if there's any out there.
And there's one more there. Yeah. No, that's fine. That's fine.
Well, we'll take two.
So you've got a daughter?
Yeah.
So how does this experience, not writing the book necessarily, but the experience of the rape affected you with her? Like, have you found yourself like, what can I do to make sure this never happens to her?
Well, that's so funny, because you're the third person who's asked me that. And it's interesting also because she's 17 now, which is the age I was. And the first thing was this woman, I did an interview on the BBC, and she said, "So aren't you really worried about your daughter?" And I said, well, which mother isn't? I don't really understand why. I don't know, because I don't know what I would have been like if it hadn't happened to me. So I can't really say, but I do worry, and I don't know if I worry more or less than anyone else. But I think I have a real advantage over other people, because I know, I hope it doesn't happen to her. It's really kind of not up to her. But if it does, I know more than many parents that she can be fine, that she can get over it. And she knows that. It was interesting, actually, when we hadn't told her. She knew what rape was, but she was, 9 or 10 or 11 or something when the New York Times op-ed came out. And suddenly people were calling, and the next day we knew it was going to be the full page in the New York Times. And she didn't know. And so I was, now we have to tell her, and she's going to be so traumatized and all this stuff. And my wise research assistant husband said, all this baggage we have is our baggage. It's not hers. No one's told her that you're supposed to be dead and you're supposed to be depressed. No one's told her. So she just knows you. So just tell her. And then I'll never forget. We were at the table and I said, maybe you're wondering why all these people have called and the phone's ringing and all. And this is what happened to me. I just told her bare bones of it. And then I waited and she said, okay. And she said, pass the cheese. And that was that, So now she knows. And it's not that it's just a thing. So I do worry about her, but I don't know if I worry more about her than anybody else. I was worried when I was pregnant, interestingly enough. I thought, if it's a girl, it's all going to come out, but it didn't. So I wish I could know if I would have been different. Maybe I'd have worried more. I don't know.
And there was one more question, I guess. Where was that? You're good? Okay.
Any concluding remarks, Sohaila?
No.
Okay, thank you so much for a very informative, interesting discussion.
Thank you.